Hello, everyone. My name is Madison, and I'm a transfer student here at UCLA. This is my third year, and I study history. I'm planning to minor in Southeast Asian studies, but today I'm going to be presenting about Iran and how khatam-kari can be seen as an act of resistance. Khatam is an ancient handicraft technique on the walls of this jewelry box below. I began studying this style of ornamentation when I was asked to write the history of an object in History 94 here at UCLA. I was gifted this jewelry box recently when my partner's mom was forced to return to the US from Iran during the beginning of the pandemic. The stress and financial burden of the pandemic would not stop her from bringing a suitcase full of presents for all her family and friends here in California. She gifted me this jewelry box and explained how it was handcrafted by a bazaar merchant in Tehran. She then gave me the Che Guevara portrait and told me while laughing that I might have to hide it because I don't like him here. When looking at these gifts together, I began to imagine what it would be like to shop for affordable handmade goods alongside portraits of leftist revolutionaries. This was a bizarre and foreign notion to me, and I assume others who grew up in the US would agree. I have learned through my research that khatam-kari is ancient in origin, yet its current existence can be viewed as symbolic of Iran's increasingly isolated economic situation since the 1979 revolution. Iran has, to a certain degree, been forced to isolate itself from the West's industrial imperialistic powers that value economic gains more than craftsmanship and cultural tradition. Now, here's some brief background info about khatam. It is made of wood, bone, and metal that are combined into geometric rods that are then glued together and thinly sliced to adorn the walls of wooden objects, such as my jewelry box. You can see it in the picture below. Traditionally, in Iran, certain villages would develop artistic mastery in a particular handicraft. The economic livelihood and cultural practices of a village would come to depend on these decorative handicrafts. It's currently practiced in Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tehran, but this practice was almost eradicated entirely. So now I'll go into a very simplified explanation of the downfall of Hatam. It started to fall out of style in the late 1800s due to the elite favoring European motifs. But most detrimental was that industrialization caused European machine-made goods to flood into the Iranian market. The prominence and quality of handmade goods declined. They basically couldn't keep up with the industrial methods of production. Important economic and cultural traditions were disappearing as local crafts were forced to compete in global markets to meet the needs of a global consumer. The 1920s actually marked its lowest point when there were only 6 master workers remaining in Isfahan, in addition to 3 in Tehran. Women in particular were hit very hard by the ruin of these handicrafts. Many found themselves without work and no means of livelihood anymore. This is really important to note because modernization is thought to coincide with more opportunities for women, more freedoms for women. But in this case, their very forms of expression and economic power were being destroyed in the name of modernization. In addition, this shift to labor in industrial warehouses was harmful to women and most other workers, obviously because of things like harsher working conditions, longer hours, and unsafe conditions. The downfall was only intensified in the late 20th century. Iran's participation in trade with foreign markets had basically been contested from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Politicians who advocated for unequal trade participation and unfettered industrialization would in time become associated with corruption and greed by both Islamists and leftists alike. The reign of the last Shah and the ousting of Prime Minister Masada in the 1952 coup executed by the US and UK would begin these associations that would lead to the revolution. Under the last Shah, large-scale modern industry was introduced with US assistance into Iran. The Shah declared that he said this, "I could not stop building supermarkets. I wanted a modern country. Moving against the bazaar was typical." This impact was basically detrimental to those without ties to global political goals or oil revenue, which is, of course, most of the population. Um, The impact can basically be summed up in this brief quote that a tax collector said in reporting on Isfahan's commercial crisis. He says, in the past, good quality textiles were manufactured in Isfahan since everyone from the highest to lowest in society wore local products. But in the last few years, the people have given up their body and soul to buy the colorful and low quality but cheap products of Europe. In doing so, they have incurred greater losses than they imagined. Local weavers in imitating foreign fabrics have lowered their qualities. Russians have stopped buying Iranian textiles, and many occupations have suffered great losses. So obviously, he's touching on some of the major impacts: occupations becoming obsolete, and cultural practices being disregarded in the face of modernity. These economic disasters, along with other cultural and social reasons, led most of the general public in Iran to oppose the government's corrupt attempts to modernize their economy and culture. The leftists, along with merchants and handicraft artisans, opposed the development of monopoly capitalist markets, while Islamists, on the other hand, opposed attempts to secularize and westernize Iranian society. But both sides did agree that they wanted to nationalize industry and promote domestic production with limited foreign imports. During the revolution, protesters used forms of calculated violence. Targets of their destructions are telling. They attacked places like banks, nightclubs, cinemas, offices of the Shah, and police stations. To them, these places were symbols of a corrupt regime, including moral corruption, influence of Western culture, economic exploitation, and political repression. I will now talk about the aftermath of the revolution. I'm only going to focus on the economic impact as it applies to Khatam and the bazaar. Eventually, the Khomeini regime emerged to replace the Shah. The council enacted new economic policies, including the nationalization of banks, insurance companies, and major industry, and some categories of urban land. These drastic changes ended up resulting in expropriation of wealth of leading business and industrial families, along with the revitalization of the traditional bazaar. So after these new policies, the bazaar and handicrafts began to repossess cultural and economic significance. The difference is clear when you compare Khomeini's declaration, "We must preserve the bazaar with all our might," to the Shah's previously mentioned declaration, "I could not stop building supermarkets. I wanted a modern country." Moving against the bazaar was typical. The complicated and time-consuming methods of handicrafts were not viable when put in competition with mass production. But economic policies were put in place after the revolution with the intention of protecting these culturally significant handicrafts like khatam. The name given to the struggle to protect traditional industry and culture was an economy of resistance. This concept was first introduced in a 2012 speech by Ayatollah Khomeini. He explains that the resistance economy will aim to create an Islamic economy that promotes self-reliance to weaken the impact of US economic and trade sanctions, which is obviously still a problem today, especially during the time of COVID. And there's a determination here by Iran's ruler to choose self-reliance during economic isolation in an attempt to maintain autonomy from foreign powers who would impose rapid industrialization and privatization. The bazaar serves as a location domestically produced goods are bought and sold. It provides stable employment opportunities while preserving traditional Iranian customs. Here, the worker also owns the product of their labor. Today, because of all of this, I see the bazaar as a place resisting complete industrialization of production along with the corporate method of selling goods. Likewise, khatam stands in resistance to mass production. Handicrafts like khatam fit perfectly into what a resistive economy aims to protect. These crafts have traditional Iranian cultural and economic significance. They provide stable employment opportunities and export revenue, and they are self-sufficient as its materials are sourced and produced domestically. In this picture, you can see the man surrounded by khatam jewelry boxes just like my own. In conclusion, I will always cherish this Hatam-style jewelry box because it was given to me by a loved one, but I've also learned to cherish it because of the unique cultural, economic, and political history that allowed it to exist. I do think it's unfortunate that only through isolation the Iranian government is able to actively support traditional crafts that many people's life revolve around culturally and economically. I would lastly like to say that this situation is not exclusive to Iran or Khatam. Unfortunately, the systematic elimination of traditional forms of labor, sustenance, and culture is common within capitalist industrialization. With Western ideas of modernization, certain practices become viewed as unproductive, inefficient, and even backwards. What follows is generally exploitation, expropriation, and even elimination. Hatam was an example of near elimination, but in the most extreme and horrible cases, entire groups of people are deemed disposable and irrelevant in the eyes of political powers attempting to modernize through industrialization and capitalist growth. So I will also cherish this jewelry box because I see its creation as an act of resistance to capitalist violence. Now what follows is just my works cited pages. The citations for the images are also at the end. Thank you.